All right, well, that's theology, and moving on to philosophy, towards a Christian philosophy is what's being addressed here. So Reformed apologists of all kinds surveyed in the previous chapter call for Christians to develop a Christian philosophy that is based on its own principles and is faithful to the Christian revelation. Hey, I was just talking about that. Well, Evan Plantinga, the most renowned Reformed philosopher of the past century and representative of what we call the left wing of Reformed apologetic traditions, will serve as their example here. So not so much a political philosophy, but just a different avenue that we would find from someone like maybe Greg Bahnsen. Well, in his papers, Advice to Christian Philosophers, he urges Christian philosophers to be more independent of the academic philosophies established to display more integrity or wholeness in their work. And over the past probably 20 years, that's been a better calling for Christian within the elements of the faculty, and to be bolder in affirming their Christian perspective. He points out that the Christian community has its own questions, its own concerns, its own topics for investigation, its own agenda, and its own research program. So be Christian in your academics.
That's right. Focus on your Christian issues, Christian, types of discussions and problems and that sort of thing, right? And so he illustrates this point, for instance, with the problem of evil. He says, against those who press the reality of evil as evidence weighing against belief in God's existence, he replies that in ordinary reasoning, such evidence is weighed along with the rest of what the person considering this evidence already knows and already believes to be true, right? And so he then suggests that the Christian has every right to include belief that God exists as a basic part of that body of truth that is already believed and possessed, and in which case the reality of evil will then not undermine the person's confidence that God exists, right? So we have background knowledge, we have things that we already hold to be the case, true, and so the problem of evil doesn't really affect, he's suggesting, or undermine the person's confidence that God exists. It's an issue, you need to deal with it, but it doesn't mean that God doesn't exist all of a sudden because, here's an argument for the problem of evil, based on the Christian's view of the world, their worldview, and how they, their background assumptions and that sort of thing.
Right. Look at the abolitionist movement versus the pro-life movement. The abolition movement tends to be almost strictly presuppositional in basis of affirming that all humanity, including even our unborn neighbors, are made in the image of God and are worthy of protection, and those that violate that sanctity of life deserve just punishment. So we see that outplaying even today from this call that Plantinga has within the problem of evil, which we would say that abortion is definitely a problem of evil there. Well, much of what Plantinga says here will resonate with more conservative Reformed apologetics. One key difference, though, is that he concludes that Christian philosophers ought to be prepared to argue their position based on premises acceptable to non-Christian philosophers, while not treating such arguments as primary or necessary justifications for their position. So he's going to give kind of a little bit more credence to allowing for some common ground than what people that follow Bahnsen or Gordon Clark are going to allow there. Well, for Van Til, on the other hand, as for most conservative Reformed apologists, it is impossible to find any premise acceptable to non-Christians from which the Christian position can be validly defended. And I would think that probably that results from Plantinga being not entrenched, that's probably a bad connotation, but at least familiar enough with the academics so that he wants to have conversations with them. He wants to respond to them. He wants to probably not have to go back to first principles all the time with his purposes there. I could be outside the lines there, but I would think that's probably where he's coming from, where Van Til is a repudiation of the academics and wanting to always go back to the ideas of, all right, well, where do you start and why do you hold those positions, and can you hold the positions after that?
Right. And so notice Van Til really wants to focus on the conflict, right? Whereas, Plantinga here is trying to find some common ground.
Right. Right, exactly. Well, whereas Plantinga argues that the rational respectability of theism, especially Christian theism, Van Til argues of the rational inescapability of Christian theism, and only specifically Christian theism. He says that we as Christians alone have the position that is philosophically defensible. So out of all the worldviews in the world, you're telling me that Christianity is the only correct one? Well, yes. And in fact, the Bible tells us that we need to have that idea. And so this type of apologetics is Van Til's outward expression of just agreeing with that sentimentality in all aspects of life. Jesus is Lord of all. Where is he not Lord? Well, let's give the unbeliever the ability to not have to claim that Jesus is Lord. Okay, right. I don't think that's included in the all. I know for both the Reformed and non-Reformed camp, we sometimes get hooked up too much on the word all, but here it seems pretty clear what Jesus Lord of all means.
Right. Right. So notice here, and this is the big difference here. Plantinga is arguing, they tell us for the rational respectability of theism. That is, it's reasonable to believe that God exists, and it's respectable. Whereas Van Til is arguing for the rational inescapability of Christian theism. It's not only he goes quite further than Plantinga, right? It's not only just reasonable believe, it's inescapable. You can't help but believe, right? And so that's kind of the big difference here. Yeah. With regard to
Plantinga wants a seat at the table. Van Til has tipped over the other table, has established his own table, and is dragging people over to it and saying, you can't escape this table.
That's right.